A great work of narrative history. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a video in which I'm going to talk about narrative history, and really I'm going to be reviewing a great work of narrative history. That's The Fate of the Day by Rick Atkinson. The people over at Random House contacted me and asked me if I wanted a review copy of this book to read, and I definitely did, because I'm well aware of Rick Atkinson's reputation with his books like The Thin Gray Line and the first book in this series, which is The British Are Coming, and also a series of 3 books about American involvement in World War II in Europe. And so when they reached out to me and asked if I wanted a review copy of the second book in his Revolution series, The Fate of the Day, I enthusiastically said yes. And I read the book in April. It came out on April the 29th. I read the book in April. I wanted to share some thoughts with you about this and about narrative history. So, if you don't know, there are really different types of history or different approaches to the way in which history is written. One is kind of an academic history, and these histories are oftentimes very specific, focused on a narrow subject, attempting to explain using research why something is the way it was, looking at a relatively small issue perhaps and its impact on larger issues that it can be really academic, like the history of the tractor in settling the upper plain states between these years. That's a kind of work of academic history. And then there are narrative histories. There are other types as well, but they're narrative histories which essentially attempt to tell a story. Now I taught history for a long time, both in high school and at the community college level. I have an advanced degree in history, and so I have some grounding in the academic ideas or in the academic history world. But what I've always loved and the way I've always approached history is as narrative history, as a story about how things came to be the way they were, or a story about what happened in the past. And certainly in American history, in the United States of America, the story of our founding, the story of the Revolutionary War, is itself one of the stories that is the heart of how we think about ourselves as a nation. A lot of the mythology around the United States of America has to do with the United States winning its independence, against these incredibly long odds, just, plucky farmers and frontiersmen who got down their, squirrel shooting rifles and went out and defeated the highly professional, incredibly large British Army. And, one of the things that I always like teaching about is kind of correcting some of those myths. For instance, the idea that the American colonists had no military experience whatsoever is, of course, not true. A lot of those men had a fairly extensive military experience, while some didn't. And kind of then talking about how the United States came into existence. Now, I didn't read the first book. I didn't read The British Are Coming, but I will definitely go back and read it now. But The Fate of the Day essentially covers the American Revolutionary War from, let's see, it says 1777 to 1780. It goes from Ticonderoga, the British recapturing of Ticonderoga, a fort on Lake Champlain, to the British capture of Charleston in South Carolina in 1780. So it kind of covers some fairly dark years of the American Revolution. So we have Valley Forge here. We have the George Washington's defeats at Germantown and at Brandywine. It's after kind of that initial elation after Washington, crosses the Delaware and defeats the British at Trenton and Princeton. And so what we kind of have here are almost think kind of the dog days of the war, with some very few moments of real elation, but some very important things happening. The American victory over the British and defeat of General Burgoyne's army at Saratoga being chief among them, and how that helped to the American colonists to secure the support of France in our war to win our independence. France obviously had larger imperial aims and a rebalancing of power in Europe, kind of aims that went beyond what we wanted, but essentially their assistance comes in here. We meet Lafayette, we meet General von Steuben, we meet a lot of figures from American history in this book, and Atkinson does a great job, I think, of introducing all these characters, and without going into full biography of any of them, introducing these characters, introducing these figures from history, and kind of, I think, giving us just the right amount of insight into who they were as people. They don't come out as perfect individuals. They definitely come out as flawed, and yet committed to doing the job they had. One of the most fascinating characters in this period, I think, during the American Revolution is Benedict Arnold, who, up to the point we have now, hasn't actually necessarily betrayed the American colonists or the future United States of America. Was well on his way to doing that. And I just really appreciated the way in which Atkinson was able to filter through and condense and assemble this vast research, because the book, despite being an narrative work of history, has all the components of an academic work of history. How he's able to distill these things down and to create an enjoyable, entertaining, insightful work of narrative history, which kind of carries us along from the battlefields in the American colonies to battles that took place on the Atlantic Ocean to the Palace of Versailles and Franklin and his time in Paris to King George and his advisors in London and what was going on in all these places. And he kind of weaves us all together to create, I think, just a great work of narrative history, one of which I was incredibly impressed. Atkinson is an excellent writer, and he's able to, I think, imbue his writing with a sense of humor where it's necessary. He has a great grasp of the content, and he can exemplify or bring out the tragic and the difficult without it becoming overly sentimental. I think his viewpoint on George Washington, who was, I think inarguably the most important figure during the American Revolution, is one that is measured and reasonable, where he highlights the mistakes Washington makes. He talks about his strengths at the same time. So, there isn't necessarily this kind of hero worshiping American history that I think many of us these days kind of cringe at. But he also doesn't sell anybody short for the things they did, the sacrifices they made. So if you haven't picked this up, if you are interested in American history, and particularly the history of the American Revolution, I can highly recommend The Fate of the Day, and I have no reason to believe that The British Are Coming, the first volume in this series of books, isn't equally excellent. Anyway, if you've read this book or have any thoughts about The Fate of the Day or Rick Atkinson as a historian, please leave those comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.